The kitchen clock ticked louder than my daughter-in-law's laugh when she said, "We keep her for tax breaks." Still, I folded the dish towel like her words hadn't just turned me into a receipt. As the ticking filled the silence between us, I watched her pour wine into my wedding crystal. While she bragged about deductions, I reached for the folder labeled contingency in my late husband's handwriting. The same clock that once counted family dinners now counted down to eviction. That's when I called the attorney and bought the silence they never saw coming. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Dorothy's footsteps were silent on the cool linoleum floor as she stepped into the kitchen. She paused, unseen in the doorway, her eyes falling on Brianna, who stood with her back to her, a phone wedged between her shoulder and ear. Brianna's voice was loud, carefree, like the voice of someone who hadn't been caught. "We keep her for tax breaks. That's like $4,000 in deductions." Brianna laughed, a sharp, almost triumphant sound that filled the space between them. Jason chuckled too, low and indulgent, as if it were a joke. "She's harmless," he said, sounding far too pleased with himself. Dorothy's fingers gripped the edge of her coffee mug so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her breath slowed, controlled. She didn't let them see how much it stung. Not that it mattered. They never noticed. Never saw the way her shoulders sagged a little more each time she played the part of the compliant mother-in-law, the one who was too old to care, too set in her ways to make a fuss. She didn't say a word, didn't acknowledge their laughter. Instead, she simply picked up her mug, feeling the heat of it in her palm, the solidness of it as she walked out of the room. She passed through the hallway, the small creaks of the floorboards familiar beneath her slippers. Every movement deliberate, like she was closing a door on something much bigger than the kitchen. The moment she reached her room, the phone rang. It was Marge. "Still want to come Tuesday?" came the gravelly voice, sharp and familiar. Dorothy set her mug down on the bedside table and sat on the edge of her bed. "Yes, and bring your legal pad," she replied, her voice steady, betraying nothing. There was a pause, then a soft, knowing chuckle from Marge. "I knew you'd say that." Dorothy hung up and stared at the cluttered desk in front of her, where her old banking files sat like they had for years, a lifetime of receipts, statements, and papers she had organized with precision. As if she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the day when it would all become more than just paperwork, waiting for the day when it would become her lifeline. Her fingers moved over the stack of papers, touching them one by one with a kind of reverence. She slid the top file open and began flipping through the pages, eyes scanning the numbers, the dates, the small, precise notations in the margins that only she understood. It had been a long time since she'd had to look at any of this. A long time since she'd had to think about it. But today, it all mattered. The sounds of the house around her were distant now. The muffled clink of dishes, the low hum of the television from the living room. She let it all fade away. She was alone with her thoughts now, and the list she was making. She didn't need to check the numbers twice. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every deduction, every claim, every overlooked detail. She had always been the bookkeeper, the quiet observer, the one who kept the ledger in order while everyone else spent their time thinking only of the numbers that mattered to them. Now, she was going to fix it. She was going to write her own sentence, a sentence that would change everything. Dorothy reached for the pen. She'd done the math in her head already, but now she needed to see it on paper. The list was short, simple. Only a few words, but those words would be enough. She drew a line beneath them. 1. Sever dependency status. 2. Transfer title to co-op. 3. Legal dissolution of shared assets. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. enough to pull the thread that had been hanging loose for far too long. She sat back in her chair and stared at the list, watching the ink dry. The gravity of what she was about to do settled over her like a heavy, comforting blanket. There was no going back now. And maybe there never had been. Her eyes shifted toward the clock. Tuesday was only 2 days away, and when she met Marge at the diner, everything would begin. Dorothy let out a breath, steadying herself. A small smile played at the corner of her lips. There was something oddly freeing about it. The act of taking control, of rewriting the rules that had always been stacked against her. She stood and walked toward the window, the fading light of the late afternoon spilling across the garden. A gentle wind stirred the leaves outside, and for a moment Dorothy just watched it, letting the stillness fill her. She had been written out of their lives in more ways than one, but she would write herself back in. This time it would be on her terms, and they would notice. The bell above the door jingled as Dorothy stepped into Maplewood Diner, the scent of frying bacon and brewed coffee wrapping around her like a blanket. It was early, the morning fog still clinging to the edges of the town, but the diner was already busy. The clatter of silverware and quiet chatter filled the space, but Dorothy barely noticed. She was already focused on the table at the far corner, where Marge was sitting, her legal pad spread out in front of her, as always, ready. Dorothy made her way over, her worn shoes scraping lightly on the tiled floor. Marge looked up from her notes, her sharp eyes scanning Dorothy's face for something, but whatever she was searching for, she didn't find. Dorothy didn't say anything as she sat down. The folder in her hands was the only thing that spoke for her. Marge raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask. She knew better than to break the silence. Dorothy slid the folder across the table, the papers inside rustling as they settled. Marge opened it slowly, taking in the house title, the tax printouts, the original deed to the property. The weight of everything between those pages hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. "You're serious," Marge said finally, her voice low, almost cautious. Dorothy didn't respond at first. She just watched as Marge flipped through the papers, her old, practiced eyes taking in the details. Marge finally looked up. "They used your SSN for dependency?" "3 years running," Dorothy replied, her voice even, but the undercurrent of anger was unmistakable. She could still hear their voices, Brianna's gleeful tone echoing in her mind. "We keep her for tax breaks." The words were still there, floating just beneath her calm exterior, threatening to bubble over. Dorothy exhaled slowly. "I want a clean break. Quiet, fast, and final." Marge's lips pressed into a thin line. She was no stranger to people who wanted to leave things behind, but there was something different in Dorothy's eyes. A quiet resolve that Marge hadn't seen in a long time. It reminded her of the Dorothy from years ago. The one who never let anything slip through the cracks. The one who knew exactly what she was doing, even when no one else did. "You know who can do that, right?" Marge asked, her voice taking on a tone of gentle knowing. "You're not talking about a simple will rewrite here." Dorothy's gaze never wavered. "I know. I need something more than that." Marge closed the folder and pushed it aside, her eyes narrowing as she took in the full measure of the situation. "You'll want Travis Lane. He's surgical with severances," she said, her voice almost admiring, as if she'd heard stories about Travis that were best left unspoken. Dorothy nodded. She already knew. She'd made up her mind. The only thing left was to make the call. Marge reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled business card, sliding it across the table toward Dorothy. "Thursday. He'll make sure it's clean. Make sure it sticks." Dorothy took the card with a steady hand, glancing down at the name printed in crisp black ink. Travis Lane, tax attorney. The phone number below it seemed insignificant compared to the weight of what it represented. She tucked the card into her pocket without a word, the decision already made. "I'll call him," Dorothy said, her voice low and decisive. Her eyes flickered briefly to the clock on the wall. "It'll be done by Thursday." Marge studied her for a moment longer, then leaned back in her seat, folding her arms across her chest. "They'll notice eventually," she said, her voice quiet but full of knowing. Dorothy didn't answer. She didn't need to. The thought of their surprise, their shock, almost brought a sense of calm. She'd been the one left behind. But now she would be the one pulling the strings. Marge pushed the empty coffee cup toward the edge of the table, her eyes narrowing with something like understanding. "You won't regret this." Dorothy took a breath, but her gaze remained fixed ahead, her mind already ahead of the moment, already planning what came next. "I'll take my chances." With that, she stood, smoothing the front of her sweater and reaching for the folder. The rustle of paper filled the space between them, a final note in an unspoken symphony. Marge didn't need to say another word. She knew what was coming. And somehow, Dorothy knew, too. As she walked out of the diner, the bell above the door jingled again. The world outside was waiting, but for the first time in a long time, Dorothy felt in control. The cool morning air hit her face, sharp and refreshing. And she stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle over her. The next step was clear. The break had been filed. Now the pieces would fall into place, and it would all be over in 2 days. Dorothy's hand hovered over the envelope as it lay on the kitchen counter, a soft rustle of paper as the sun streamed through the window, catching the edges of the crisp, pre-filled tax form. The numbers and boxes blurred for a moment, her mind swimming in the familiar, tedious language of deductions and credits. The form was so simple, yet it held the weight of everything she had worked to escape. She didn't have to open it. She already knew what it said. The numbers were the same as last year, the year before that, the year before that. Claim dependent. Her name, her social security number, her life written down in neat, impersonal rows of black ink. From behind her, she heard Brianna's voice, shrill with a sense of entitlement. "It's just housekeeping, Mom. You've been such a help." Dorothy's fingers pressed against the envelope, the smoothness of it against her skin a reminder of how little her presence was truly valued. This wasn't housekeeping. This was control, wrapped in a neat little package with a bow on top. This was business, not family. She felt her breath catch in her throat, but her face remained calm, her expression unreadable. "No, thank you," Dorothy said, her voice almost too quiet for the clattering of dishes in the background. It was the first time she had spoken those words aloud, and they felt foreign, strange, like a door opening she hadn't known was there. Brianna's tone shifted instantly, laced with confusion and a touch of frustration. "What? It's just a form, Mom. Just sign it and we're done. You've been so good about all of this." The words were meant to soothe, to press her back into the role they had assigned her. But Dorothy felt nothing but a chill in her chest. She turned the form over in her hands, feeling the weight of the decision she had already made. Her fingers trailed over the lines, the place where her signature was supposed to go. The place where her name had always been written in the past. Her thumb brushed the edge of the paper, but she did not sign it. Not this year, not ever, again. "No, thank you," she repeated, louder this time, her voice firm. Jason appeared in the doorway, the sound of his footsteps heavy on the floorboards. "What's going on?" His voice was more insistent now, a little worried. He crossed the threshold into the kitchen, his gaze flicking between Dorothy and the tax form, his brow furrowing as he processed the scene. "Just sign it, Mom," he said, his tone soft but commanding. "It's all set up. It's easy. Just a few more years, and then we can all move on with our lives." Dorothy's eyes met his, steady and unyielding. The weight of years of silence and sacrifice settled between them, unspoken, but heavy all the same. She felt something break in her chest, a final fracture that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. "Not this year," Dorothy said, the words cold, like stones falling into an empty well. "Or any again." She pushed the form toward him, her hand sliding off it as if releasing a part of herself. It was a subtle motion, but it felt monumental. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment, searching for a flicker of recognition, some understanding in the space between them, but there was nothing. Nothing but the dullness of his gaze, the way he stood there, waiting for her to comply. A silence stretched out between them, thick and suffocating. Brianna's voice was a distant hum, but it didn't reach her. Nothing could. Dorothy felt her chest rise and fall, slow and steady, as she turned her back on them both. "I'm leaving," she said, each word carrying its own weight. "I'm not signing, I'm done." Without waiting for a reply, Dorothy gathered her things, her purse, her coat, and moved past them, the motion brisk, deliberate. As she reached the door, she felt the familiar weight of the world shift, as though the ground beneath her had finally begun to crack. Jason didn't try to stop her. He didn't even call out, not even when she pulled the door open, the creak of the hinges the only sound that followed her. Brianna, too, remained silent, her expression unreadable, like she had finally realized that Dorothy wasn't playing along anymore. Outside, the air was cool, sharp with the promise of change. Dorothy closed the door behind her with a soft thud, her steps quick and purposeful as she made her way down the front steps. The car was waiting for her at the curb, a sleek black sedan that seemed too out of place for the neighborhood. But it didn't matter. Everything that was familiar now felt foreign, and every step she took away from the house felt like freedom. Travis was waiting inside, and in 2 days, this would all be over. As the car pulled away from the curb, Dorothy stared out the window, her reflection fragmented by the movement of the passing streets. She had severed the ties that had bound her for so long, and the hardest part was over. The next part, the one that would undo it all, was waiting. For the first time in years, Dorothy felt a flicker of something more than quiet resignation. She felt the heat of possibility, like a fire burning just beneath her skin. She wasn't just walking away. She was walking towards something else. Something new. The office was cold, the air heavy with the scent of leather-bound files and fresh printer paper. The low hum of a distant printer whirred behind Dorothy as she sat across from Travis Lane's polished desk, the form in front of her staring back like an impersonal judge. Travis didn't look up immediately. His hands moved methodically, pulling out a few papers, adjusting the paperwork with precision, as if every moment of the process was part of a delicate dance. Finally, he slid the form across the desk to her. Form 2120, the document that would sever the one remaining tie that had bound Dorothy to her son and daughter-in-law. "Here it is," Travis said, his voice calm, detached. He didn't need to explain. He had seen it all before. Dorothy's hand hesitated over the paper for just a moment. The weight of the decision hung heavily between them, but she didn't flinch. Her fingers, steady as ever, moved to the line where her signature was required. She signed it with a fluid motion, almost mechanical, but something deeper lingered beneath. A shift, a moment of profound release. This was it. The final line. "Revocation of dependent status," Travis murmured, watching her carefully. "That's a clean break." Dorothy didn't answer. She just leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest, her mind already racing ahead to what came next. She could already feel the weight of the change pressing on her chest, like the first breath of a storm. Travis set down his pen, eyeing her as if waiting for her to say something more, but Dorothy stayed silent, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but she wasn't ready to speak yet. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. This was the moment when everything she had been holding in came to the surface. He cleared his throat. So, you want to sever ties completely? Dorothy's lips parted, but she didn't respond right away. She was thinking about the house, the years she had spent there, the way the walls seemed to close in on her little by little. The house wasn't hers anymore, not in any real way. It had become an anchor, tying her down, keeping her in a place she no longer belonged. I want to sever everything, Dorothy said at last, her voice steady, unyielding. Tax ties, property, all of it. Travis nodded slowly, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Understood. We'll initiate asset reseparation. The house will legally be transferred to you. We'll set up the senior co-op as a new domicile, and from here on out, you'll have complete control. Dorothy felt a pulse of something deep within her, a recognition of the finality in his words. Complete control. It was a promise wrapped in the cold efficiency of the law, but it was her promise now. She leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as she considered the next step. I want everything rerouted. Address change. Mail goes to Sweet Haven from now on. Travis raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. Of course, he said, scribbling the details on his pad. No problem. It'll take a few days to process, but we'll get everything shifted over. Dorothy nodded, almost absently. Her thoughts were elsewhere, focused on what she would do when everything was official. It wasn't enough just to walk away. She had to make sure there were no remnants left. Nothing that could drag her back. I don't want any announcements, Dorothy added, her voice low, controlled. Let them notice on their own. A brief smile tugged at the corners of Travis's mouth, as if he understood. There was a satisfaction in the quiet destruction she was leaving behind, something that only someone in her position could understand. Let them notice, he repeated, and for the first time, his tone carried a touch of admiration. The papers were signed, the forms filed, everything was in motion. Dorothy was no longer a dependent on anyone's terms. The house, now legally hers, would be transferred to a senior co-op under her control. And as for her former life, the ties were already being severed, piece by piece, with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. As Travis prepared the paperwork for her to file, Dorothy stood and made her way to the window of his office, looking out over the busy streets of Boise. The city below seemed distant, almost unrecognizable to her now. She had spent so many years here, playing a part in a story that never truly belonged to her. But she had turned the page. She thought about the house, the place she'd once called home. It had been the backdrop of so many years, both good and bad. The memories were still there, echoing in the corners, but now they felt like a distant echo. She wasn't running from them. She was simply leaving them behind. The door opened behind her, and Travis's voice interrupted her thoughts. All set. You can file these today, and we'll finalize everything soon. Dorothy turned, taking the forms from him. She didn't say anything, but she knew what she was doing. She knew what she was leaving behind. And she knew that, for the first time in years, she had finally taken control. Her fingers tightened around the forms. No more waiting. No more silences. The world she had known was fading. The world she was about to step into was all her own. As she walked out of the office and into the cool air of the parking lot, she could almost feel the weight of everything lifting, piece by piece. The sound of the city felt muffled, distant, as though she were no longer part of it. The car waited for her. Sweet Haven was waiting for her. And as she got inside, the engine started and the world shifted. This time it was on her terms. Brianna's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her breath coming quicker as the message on the screen became clearer. Tax form error. Dependent ID flagged. Potential violation detected. The red warning flashed across the monitor like a neon sign in a dark room, its message stark and undeniable. She stared at the screen, unblinking, as if willing it to disappear, to somehow reset, to fix itself. But it didn't. Damn it. She muttered under her breath, her hands trembling as she clicked through the software, retracing the steps she had entered just days before. The form she'd filed should have been routine. A simple claim. But the system was telling her otherwise, and the last thing she needed right now was a problem that could threaten her refund. She glanced at Jason, who was sprawled on the couch, eyes glued to his phone. He had no idea. No clue that their tax return was unraveling in front of her. Jason, Brianna's voice cracked slightly as she stood up, the panic already creeping in. You need to call your mother. Jason barely looked up from his phone. Why? She's the dependent. There's an issue with the form. The system's flagging her ID. You need to talk to her. Figure out what the hell is going on. Jason sighed, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. Why can't you just call her? Brianna hesitated, her fingers gripping the phone like it might slip from her hands. She wanted to shout, to explain how serious this was. But instead, she did what she always did. She smoothed it over, taking control of the situation in the only way she knew how. I'll leave a message, she said, swallowing hard as she dialed Dorothy's number. The phone rang once, twice, but there was no answer. Brianna clenched her teeth and left a message, her voice slightly too sweet, trying to cover the desperation that was beginning to creep through. Mom, it's Brianna. There's been a glitch with the tax form. It's showing an issue with your dependent ID. Can we talk? Please call me back as soon as you get this. She hung up, her chest tightening. This was bad. Worse than bad. She could feel it, like the earth shifting beneath her feet. At Sweet Haven, Dorothy sat outside on a shaded patio, the sun warm but not oppressive. The quiet buzz of the community around her was oddly comforting. She watched the other residents come and go, all of them wrapped in their routines, none of them noticing the storm brewing on the other side of her life. Marge sat across from her, an iced tea in hand, the condensation on the glass catching the sunlight. So, what now? Marge asked, her voice low but sharp with curiosity. Have they figured it out yet? Dorothy didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about the call, the message that Brianna had left her. It had been too polite, too calm. As if Brianna expected her to simply fix things, to bend to whatever had been broken, but Dorothy wasn't going to fix it. Not anymore. She took a slow sip of her tea, letting the coolness settle in her throat. They'll figure it out soon enough. If they haven't already. Marge didn't press her. She knew better than to expect Dorothy to elaborate. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, watching the people around them, the subtle energy of a place where quiet lives played out in small, predictable movements. I told you, Marge said after a pause. You don't just walk away from people like that. There's always a price. Dorothy glanced at her, the faintest flicker of a smile tugging at her lips. I'm not walking away, she said. I'm standing still. Let them come to me. The words felt final, almost prophetic, as if Dorothy had become something more than just a woman in the midst of a personal rebellion. She had become a force, and the world around her was the one that would change. Back at the house, Jason's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He picked it up lazily, scrolling through notifications, but then his eyes landed on something that stopped him cold. It was a letter from the IRS, and the subject line sent a jolt through him. Tax violation risk, dependency claim denied. Brianna rushed over as soon as she saw the letter, her face pale. What the hell is this? She asked, her hands trembling as she pulled the email open. It can't be right, Jason muttered, his mind racing. He read through it again, his stomach sinking with each line. The IRS was claiming they had improperly filed for Dorothy's dependency. And now, the claim was officially denied. The form they had submitted was invalid. There was no room for mistakes here. The penalties would be severe. God damn it! Brianna shouted, slamming the phone onto the table. How could she do this to us? After everything? After all we've done? She stormed away, muttering to herself about how ungrateful people could be. But Jason stayed still, staring at the screen. The weight of the situation settled on him, heavier than he had anticipated. Brianna's words had been loud, filled with anger, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something more was unraveling. He looked up at Brianna, his voice hoarse. She's not going to back down, is she? Brianna didn't answer right away, her mind caught in a swirl of frustration and disbelief. Finally, she spoke, her voice sharp and bitter. Taking care of people is so ungrateful sometimes. But her words felt hollow, and as she turned to grab her coat and head out the door, Jason couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't just Dorothy who had changed. He had too. And this was far from over. Brianna sat at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator in the background, her eyes scanning the pile of mail she'd just collected from the front porch. The usual mix of junk, catalogs, and bills? Nothing unexpected. But then she came across a letter that caught her eye. The return address was unfamiliar, and the envelope felt thicker than the others. It was postmarked from Boise, but the address was wrong. Sweet Haven Co-op. Her pulse quickened as she tore it open, flipping through the contents. It was a USPS address change notification. Dorothy's name was on it. She stared at the paper, the words blurring for a moment as something cold settled in the pit of her stomach. Dorothy had changed her address. Brianna set the letter down slowly, her fingers trembling. She knew what this meant. The sudden absence of Dorothy's mail had been nagging at her for days now, but she hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. Not yet. She should have known. Dorothy was disappearing from their lives, piece by piece. No more checks arriving for the tax claims, no more letters with small reminders of her existence. Dorothy was gone, and now her address was different. Sweet Haven, where she had moved. Brianna felt a pang of frustration, the disorienting feeling of losing control creeping up again. She grabbed her phone and dialed Jason without thinking. The line rang for a moment before his voice answered, tired, distracted. "Jason, where's Mom's mail?" Brianna asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "It's not coming here anymore. It's all being sent to Sweet Haven." Jason's voice sounded distant, a sigh escaping him. "What do you mean it's being sent there? She changed her address?" "Yeah, and she didn't tell us." Brianna's frustration boiled over. "She's cutting ties, Jason. This isn't just some little thing she's doing. She's gone." Jason didn't respond right away. She could hear him shuffling through papers, probably skimming through the same pile of mail she had just gone through. "I'll call her," he said after a long silence. "She's probably just busy. She'll pick up." But when Jason dialed Dorothy's number, there was no answer. Not the first time, not the second. His frustration, too, was building. He let the phone fall against the counter. "She's not answering. This isn't like her. Something's off. I told you." Brianna's voice dropped to a murmur. "She's pulling away. She's done with us." Jason didn't reply. But his silence said more than words ever could. The space between them stretched long, heavy. Brianna felt the weight of it press on her chest. She had never imagined it would come to this. Dorothy, her mother-in-law, had always been a quiet presence, the kind that blended into the background. She had been there, never demanding, always accepting, always the one who didn't make waves. Until now. Now, it was as if she had evaporated, leaving only echoes behind. At Sweet Haven, Dorothy was outside, adding the finishing touches to her small porch. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the freshly swept floor. She had spent the last hour hanging ferns from the railing and arranging a new wind chime, the soft metal pieces catching in the breeze with each slight gust. It was peaceful. Exactly the kind of quiet she had been craving. She placed the last fern carefully, stepping back to admire the view. The porch was simple, yet it felt like home in a way her house never had. Marge appeared at the edge of the porch, leaning against the doorframe. "Feel weird?" she asked, a slight smile tugging at her lips as she looked at Dorothy's meticulous work. Dorothy paused for a moment, her fingers brushing the chimes, the sound filling the stillness around them. She didn't turn to answer right away. "Feels final," she said softly, as if the words themselves had the weight of a decision made long ago. The wind chime echoed once more, its gentle sound almost a reminder of what she had done. The life she had walked away from felt more distant with each passing second, but this was the life she was building. And there was no going back. She didn't miss the look that passed between her and Marge, the unspoken understanding. Marge had been the one who had always known Dorothy would get here. She'd known long before Dorothy had. Before Marge could say anything more, a manila envelope appeared on the table near the door, dropped off by one of the delivery staff. It was from Travis Lane, her tax attorney. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. The seal, the legalities, the formality. It was the confirmation she had been waiting for. Dorothy reached for the envelope with a steady hand, her fingers slipping over the crisp paper before she opened it. She didn't flinch when she pulled out the contents. The legal documentation, the confirmation of her domicile withdrawal. The house, now officially in the hands of the senior co-op, no longer belonged to her son and daughter-in-law. It was hers. Completely and utterly hers. Marge took a step closer, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and respect as Dorothy read through the paperwork. Her eyes didn't waver from the text, but her lips curled into a faint smile as she placed the document down. "They'll notice," Dorothy said quietly, her voice calm but filled with a certainty that settled deep into the pit of Marge's stomach. She could almost hear the quiet chaos on the other end of the phone line. Jason, Brianna, they would be losing more than just their mother-in-law. They would lose what they thought was theirs. Marge's gaze softened, but there was no pity in her eyes. "Let them," Dorothy added, standing up to place the legal papers on the table beside her tea. "Let them figure it out." A sense of finality settled over her as she turned back to the porch, the wind chimes swaying softly in the breeze. She felt the tension in her body dissolve, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in years. The decision was made. The mail wouldn't come to the house anymore. They wouldn't get the deduction they expected. The final line had been drawn, and now the world would change. The sound of boiling water was the only noise in the room as Dorothy set the kettle down on the stove, the gentle whistle breaking the stillness. The kitchen at Sweet Haven was small but cozy, the sunlight filtering through the blinds in narrow beams that illuminated the dusty air. Dorothy moved with practiced ease, preparing tea as she had 1,000 times before, but now the motions felt different. They felt like a ritual. A way of grounding herself before the storm that was about to arrive. The doorbell rang just as the steam began to rise from the kettle. She had known it was coming, had felt the weight of it in her bones, even before Haley's name appeared on the caller ID. Still, it was a shock when Haley stepped into the doorway, looking uncertain, her posture stiff. Dorothy didn't rise from the counter immediately. She finished pouring the hot water into the teapot, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she was giving Haley the space to speak first. Haley stood there, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her jacket, her gaze darting to the table and then quickly away. "Mom's freaking out," she said, her voice tight, almost offensive. "She said you messed everything up." Dorothy turned, her face calm unreadable. She didn't rush to explain. Instead, she placed the teapot on the table, the porcelain gleaming softly in the light. She didn't need to justify her actions. Not to Haley. Not to anyone. "I didn't mess anything up, Haley," Dorothy said evenly, pouring the tea into delicate cups, the amber liquid swirling gently. "I corrected it." Haley shifted on her feet, her eyes dark with confusion and frustration. "You really moved out? Over a tax form?" Dorothy set the teacup down in front of her granddaughter, the porcelain handle cool under her fingers. There was a pause as she regarded Haley, her gaze steady, searching. Haley wasn't a child anymore, but she still wore the same wide-eyed expression when something didn't make sense, something she couldn't quite grasp. Dorothy recognized it, the way Haley was struggling to understand, to reconcile the woman in front of her with the grandmother who had always played the role of the invisible matriarch, the one who never rocked the boat. Dorothy's hand went to the small envelope on the table. It had been sitting there, unopened, but Haley needed to see it. She needed to understand why this wasn't just about a tax form. She slid the envelope across the table toward Haley, who eyed it warily before picking it up, her fingers running over the crease. Dorothy leaned back in her chair, watching as Haley tore it open and unfolded the contents. The dependency form Brianna had filed without her consent. The one that had been submitted to claim Dorothy as a dependent in order to receive tax benefits. The form that had set all of this in motion. Haley stared at the paper for a long moment, her brow furrowing as she scanned the lines. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, but Dorothy could see the realization slowly creeping in. Finally, Haley looked up, her face stricken. "You didn't sign this." Dorothy shook her head, the words that had been locked inside for so long finally coming free. "No, I didn't." "This wasn't care, Haley." Her voice was quiet but firm, and the weight of her words landed with the finality of a closing door. "This was credit." Haley blinked, the words seeming to tumble over her, the meaning sinking in slowly. "What do you mean? They were just helping you? Weren't they?" Dorothy's lips tightened, the softest sigh escaping her. "Helping me?" "No, Haley. They weren't helping me. They were claiming me, using me for money. They thought I didn't notice, thought I wouldn't care. But I do. I did." Haley swallowed hard, her eyes flickering from the form to Dorothy's face, the silent understanding finally starting to take hold. "You're saying that they took advantage of you?" Dorothy didn't flinch, didn't look away. "I'm saying they treated me like an asset, a deduction on a piece of paper. They didn't see me, not as a person, just a number, a credit." Haley's eyes softened, but there was something else there now. An unease. A realization that cut deeper than anything Dorothy could say. She had known, had felt the distance between them all along, but hearing the words laid out so plainly with no room for misinterpretation made it all too clear. "I didn't want to leave them," Dorothy continued, her voice quieter now, the weight of the years behind her. "I wanted to be there for you. For your mom. But when they filed that form without asking me, when they used me like that, it changed everything. I wasn't going to let them do it again." Haley set the form down, her hands shaking slightly. The silence stretched between them, heavy with what had been said and what had yet to be understood. Dorothy looked at her granddaughter, her heart aching in a way it hadn't in years. "You don't have to agree with me, Haley, but you need to understand. This wasn't about money. It was about respect. About being seen for who I am, not what they could claim." Haley bit her lip, her gaze distant, lost in thoughts she hadn't been prepared for. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice small, uncertain. Dorothy reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Haley's. "You don't have to say anything," she said softly. I just need you to know why I did it. Haley met her eyes, a flicker of understanding passing between them. I think, I think I get it now, she said quietly. But even as she spoke, Dorothy knew there was more to be said, more to be understood. She could feel it in the air between them, thick with unspoken words, with things that could never be unsaid. Haley didn't hug her, didn't reach out in the way that Dorothy had once hoped. But in the quiet, there was something else. Something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The room was quiet as Dorothy sat across from Travis Lane, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. The office was cool, sterile, like the calm before a storm. She had been here before, but today felt different. Today, it wasn't about forms or deductions. It was about something deeper, something that would change everything. Travis sat with her, his calm, professional demeanor never wavering. He had helped her navigate the legal maze before, but now, as he watched her pull out the old, tattered will from the folder, he knew this was no ordinary update. The familiar paper crackled as she opened it, her fingers steady as she scanned the pages for the last time. She'd held on to it for so long, this relic of the life she had built for her family. But that life had crumbled, and the legacy she was leaving behind needed to be rewritten. She traced the names at the top of the will with her finger, her eyes lingering over the familiar signatures, Jason's, Brianna's. Once, those names had meant everything to her. Once, she'd thought she would leave everything to them, pass down the life she had worked for. But things had changed. The trust was gone, replaced by betrayal. Without hesitation, Dorothy reached for a thick red pen sitting on the desk. Her grip was firm, almost final. The mark she was about to make was not just on paper. It was a mark on her entire life, on everything she had ever known. She drew a thick, deliberate line through both Jason's and Brianna's names. The ink was bold, striking, as though it was cutting through years of unspoken resentment and quiet sacrifice. They had been part of her world, but not anymore. She wasn't just severing ties. She was reclaiming something far more important: her respect, her legacy, her peace. Travis watched her in silence, no judgment in his eyes, just the understanding that she was doing what needed to be done. When Dorothy finished, she sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "Done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the finality in it hung in the air. Marge's name was written at the bottom of the page, the new executor of her will. Dorothy didn't hesitate. Marge was someone who had always been there, who had seen her through the years when others had failed to notice her quiet strength. She had earned her place in Dorothy's life, and now she would be the one to ensure that legacy was protected. But it didn't stop there. There was someone else who deserved a place. Someone who had never been part of the calculations. Haley. Dorothy paused, her hand hovering over the paper. She thought about the quiet conversation they had shared. Haley had been confused, unsure of her place in all of this. But she had listened. She had started to understand. And that understanding mattered. It had to be part of the legacy Dorothy was leaving behind. She added Haley's name beneath Marge's, but not without conditions. Truth, Dorothy wrote in bold, decisive strokes. Time. Travis raised an eyebrow as Dorothy added the final touches, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. He understood what Dorothy meant. Haley needed time to truly understand what was at stake, to grasp the weight of the decisions that had been made. And she needed truth. Not the kind of surface-level affection that had always been expected, but the kind that could only come from recognizing the realities of the past. Dorothy placed the pen down slowly, her gaze resting on the names before her. "You don't get legacy from deduction," she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying a weight of finality. Legacy is earned, not bought. With one last glance at the will, Dorothy handed it over to Travis, who immediately began the process of filing it. The sound of the papers shifting in his hands was oddly satisfying, the quiet shuffle of a life being sealed away in a way that could never be undone. Travis looked up at her, his face serious but respectful. "It's done," he said, slipping the papers into an official folder. "Effective today." Dorothy stood up, smoothing her skirt as she glanced out the window at the sprawling view of the city. She had done it. She had rewritten her story, and now it would unfold on her terms. No longer would she be a piece on someone else's chessboard. No longer would she be a dependent, claimed for the benefit of others. She was free. The wind outside shifted, and for a moment, it felt like the world was changing all around her. As Dorothy walked out of the office, the weight of the last few months, the secrets, the betrayal, the quiet decisions, lifted. The sunlight seemed brighter, the air clearer. Everything was different now. She had changed it all, and now all she had to do was wait for the rest of the world to catch up. Her phone buzzed in her bag, breaking her reverie. She didn't need to look at it. The message would come soon enough, just like the others. And when it did, she would be ready. For the first time in years, Dorothy felt like she was truly standing in her own life, unapologetic, undeterred, and ready to face whatever came next. The email sat on Dorothy's phone, a small notification banner that flickered in the corner of her screen. It was from Jason, and it was all she needed to know. The subject line was simple. "Can we talk?" She didn't open it, though. She didn't need to. The words had already been spoken, hadn't they? She didn't need another apology, another justification. She had made her decision, had made it long before that email came through. She was done with them. Done with the years of silent sacrifice, the ways they had used her without ever truly seeing her. Dorothy placed the phone down on the table beside her and walked to the window, gazing out at the sprawling gardens of Sweet Haven. The landscape was peaceful, calm. Everything was just as it should be. She had severed the ties. The rest of the world would have to catch up. Marge was in the room, sitting in the corner, reading through some of the community's announcements. She looked up, sensing the stillness in the air. "What would you say to them?" she asked quietly, almost as if she were asking herself more than Dorothy. Dorothy didn't hesitate. She didn't need to think about it. "I'd say that they broke what fed them." Her voice was flat, but there was a sharpness to it that carried the weight of everything, her entire life, all the quiet years of compromise. She could almost hear the echo of those words in her mind. Broken. Marge's eyes softened, but she didn't respond. She knew. She had always known. The doorbell rang then, the sudden sound breaking the moment. Dorothy moved toward the door, her steps calm, as though the world had settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm where she had control. When she opened the door, the air smelled of warm food and the gathering of neighbors, a potluck evening at Sweet Haven, a community event. One she'd been invited to, one she'd been asked to bring something for. Dorothy stepped outside with a smile, the peach cobbler she'd made carefully balanced in her hands. The crust was golden and perfectly baked, the warm, sweet scent of peaches rising as she placed it on the table of offerings. A neighbor, a kindly woman with soft white hair and a wide smile, raised her glass in a toast. "You look 10 years younger, Dorothy," she said, her voice a soft lilt. Dorothy smiled, accepting the compliment, but there was something else in the way she looked at the woman, something more knowing, as if the weight of the last few months had lifted with her smile. "Thank you," she said simply, as she made her way to a seat at the far end of the table. It felt good to be here, to sit in the quiet, to feel at ease in a way she hadn't felt in years. A soft ping from her phone interrupted the peace, But she didn't need to check it. She already knew who it was. Haley had sent her a message earlier, asking about volunteer hours at a local shelter. Dorothy picked up the phone and tapped open the message. It was a photo of Haley, in her volunteer uniform, smiling with the kids she was helping. Her message was simple. Keep going. Dorothy's thumb hovered over the screen for a moment. She wasn't sure why she was replying, whether it was simply a reminder to herself or a small gesture of encouragement. But she sent the message. Haley needed to understand. She needed to see the world beyond the numbers, beyond the expectations of others. She looked out over the community potluck again, her eyes softening as the evening sun began to sink lower. The quiet, mundane world she had chosen was beginning to feel like the one she belonged in. But then, another ping from her phone. She didn't expect it to be important, didn't expect to be shaken, but the subject line on the IRS notification made her pause. Jason and Brianna flagged for improper claims. Her eyes widened as she read through the message. The IRS had identified discrepancies in their tax filings. The very claims they'd made using her dependency were being scrutinized. A slow, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of Dorothy's lips. She had known somehow that this would happen, that the consequences would catch up to them. The system didn't lie. The truth was starting to unwind in ways they hadn't anticipated. For a moment, everything in the world seemed still. The clink of silverware, the low hum of quiet conversation from the other residents, it all faded into the background. There was something heavy in her chest, something that felt like the closure she had been waiting for. She hadn't asked for this outcome, but now that it was here, she couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction that settled within her. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Marge. "You okay?" It read. Dorothy sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of everything she had done and the peace she had finally found. She typed back, her fingers steady, her response simple. Better than ever. And with that, the truth was no longer a burden. It was a release. The consequences of their actions had begun, but for Dorothy, it was only the beginning. Her life was hers now, and no one would take it from her again. The screen of Dorothy's phone lit up once again, this time with an alert from one of her social media accounts. She had long since stopped checking them regularly, but something about the way the notification flickered caught her eye. It was a post from Brianna. Dorothy tapped the message open, her eyes scanning the text that was filled with a sense of frustration and barely contained anger. It's so frustrating when you take care of someone for years, only to have them pull away when you need them most. But hey, at least I'll have one less person to worry about. The words stung more than she had expected. It wasn't just a post. It was a statement. A final dismissal of everything Dorothy had done for them. Brianna wasn't just upset about the taxes. She was upset about losing her grip on something she thought she owned. And now, Dorothy could feel the weight of the battle moving into the public space. Dorothy's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she took a screenshot. The evidence was clear. She would use it to prove her point, not just to herself, but to anyone who thought she had overreacted. She was done being a silent player in a game that was never hers to begin with. The sound of the door opening behind her made her glance up. Travis Lane, her tax attorney, walked into the room with a manila folder in hand, his usual calm expression in place. "I've added this to the audit file," he said, his voice measured. "The IRS won't ignore this." Dorothy nodded, her mind already several steps ahead. "Good. Let them dig," she said with a quiet intensity. "I already built the box." Travis didn't respond right away, but there was a glimmer of something like respect in his eyes. He had been with her through all of this, the filing, the documentation, the carefully calculated moves that had shifted her life into a direction she was finally in control of. He knew what was at stake, and for the first time, he could see that Dorothy was no longer trying to keep things together. She was tearing down the walls that had been built around her for years. "Anything else you need from me?" he asked, his tone almost casual now, as though the fight had already been won. Dorothy leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in front of her. "I think I'm done with paperwork for a while," she replied, a slight smile touching her lips. The chaos had been replaced by a quiet clarity. The world outside could keep spinning in circles, but Dorothy was no longer caught in the whirlwind. The next few days were a blur of small but satisfying moments, clearing out her old office, donating what she didn't need. The bulky, outdated computer that had once been her link to a life she had no desire to revisit was now sitting on the counter, ready to be donated to the local library. It was strange how much weight that simple act lifted from her chest. As she locked the door of her old office for the last time, the finality of the moment sank in. The papers, the files, the things that had once been so important were now part of someone else's task. She didn't need them. She had moved on. And for the first time in years, she felt free. Later that week, Dorothy found herself in the old church she used to visit with her family. She hadn't been in months. The pews, once familiar and comforting, now seemed distant. She sat in the back, far from the chatter of the other visitors, the quiet of the space wrapping around her like a blanket. The soft hum of voices and the distant murmur of prayers filled the air, but Dorothy sat still, letting it all wash over her. She had never truly found peace in the church before. It had always been something she did for others, a place to meet obligations, to look like the perfect mother, the perfect wife. But now, in the silence, it felt like a place where she could truly be. No expectations, no obligations. Just a moment to sit in the stillness and breathe. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Haley. The simple text was a question, an invitation. "Can I visit again soon?" Dorothy stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. She had come to understand so much in the last few weeks, so much about herself, her family, her relationships. Haley was the one who had seen her clearly, had slowly come to understand the woman beneath the grandmother and the mother. Dorothy took a deep breath, her fingers tapping out a response. "Yes, come soon. We have things to talk about." She hit send and leaned back in her chair, the weight of the decision settling over her like a quiet wave. She didn't know what Haley would say, or how the conversation would unfold. But for the first time in years, Dorothy felt like she was finally able to shape the narrative. She wasn't just waiting for the storm to pass. She was standing tall in the midst of it, her feet firmly planted in the ground. And whatever happened next, whatever the consequences of the choices she'd made, she was ready. Ready to face them. Ready to own them. This time it would be her story, her legacy. And no one would take that from her again. The community center was buzzing with quiet energy as Dorothy stepped into the room. The hum of conversation mixed with the clink of coffee cups and the shuffle of chairs being moved. She paused just inside the door, taking a moment to steady herself. This wasn't supposed to be a grand event. It wasn't a speech or a performance. It was just her story, her truth. And yet, there was a weight to it. The small crowd of women, widows, caregivers, and the quiet warriors who had long fought battles behind closed doors, were all here to listen, to hear what she had to say. And in that, Dorothy felt the rawness of it all. She wasn't just telling her story. She was showing them that they could have a voice too. Her eyes scanned the room as she moved toward the front. She had been asked to speak. No, invited, by a local nonprofit that focused on empowering women, particularly those who had been overlooked or silenced. She wasn't sure what she had to offer them, But she knew that whatever it wasn't about giving advice. It was about sharing a piece of herself. The mistakes, the lessons, the quiet reckoning that had led her to this moment. As she reached the front, Marge was already there, standing off to the side with a reassuring smile, her arms folded. Dorothy's old friend had been her rock through all of this, the one person who had always understood when others had not. "Are you ready?" Marge asked, her voice soft but steady. Dorothy glanced back at the group, the nervous flutter in her chest trying to settle. "I think so," she replied, her voice low, but the slight crack in it betrayed her. The truth was, she had no idea if she was ready. She didn't know what they needed to hear, or if she could even articulate what she had learned. But standing in front of them, she could feel something shifting inside her. This wasn't about the past. It was about what came next. Marge nodded, her eyes twinkling with that knowing look she always had. "Remember what you've learned. It's not just therapy, it's a declaration." Dorothy took a deep breath, pushing back the doubts. The room quieted as she stepped to the microphone, the rustle of papers around her making it clear that the audience was waiting for something. She placed her hands on the table in front of her, feeling the coolness of the surface beneath her palms, grounding herself. "Never trade your peace for someone else's refund," Dorothy said, her voice clear. But it carried the weight of something deeper, something far beyond the simple words. The phrase hung in the air, the kind of statement that could be dismissed as trivial in a world focused on dollars and deductions. But for Dorothy, it was the essence of everything she had been through. She paused, letting the words settle. "I spent years giving up my peace, bit by bit, without even realizing it, for my family, for my son, for the promise of something better. But that peace is priceless. It can't be bought. Not by them. Not by anyone." Dorothy looked around the room, her eyes meeting those of the women who were listening. She saw nods, soft expressions of recognition. They understood. She wasn't the only one who had given up her peace. The quiet sacrifices were shared. The small talk turned into something else entirely. This wasn't just about taxes or familial betrayal. It was about the quiet erosion of self that so many of them had experienced. The years spent accommodating others, the weight of everyone else's expectations, the moments when they had put themselves aside for the sake of others. She continued, her voice growing steadier with each passing word. "I didn't know how much I had lost until I took it back, and that's when I realized no one else can take your peace unless you let them. And when you stop letting them, the world opens up in ways you never thought possible." As Dorothy spoke, she noticed Haley sitting at the back of the room, the young woman who had, in her own way, understood the gravity of what Dorothy had done. Haley wasn't sitting close, but Dorothy could feel her presence in the back. Haley was recording the talk, as if she were absorbing every word, every lesson. There was something almost ceremonial about it, the passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. "I'm not a speaker," Dorothy said, her gaze flicking back to Marge for a brief second. "But I'm not silent anymore either." A small laugh escaped from the audience, and it felt like a warm, shared moment. They weren't just listening, they were reflecting. Dorothy wasn't just speaking, she was seeing them. The talk stretched on, moments of reflection, of stories shared, of truths that felt too heavy to carry alone. And through it all, Dorothy knew this wasn't just about teaching. It was about healing. For her. For them. For Haley. When the talk finally ended, a soft applause filled the room. It was quiet, humble, but the appreciation was real. It wasn't for the speech itself. It was for the connection. For the permission to finally speak. Haley approached her afterward, her phone still in hand. "That was..." She paused, searching for the right word. "Powerful." Dorothy smiled, the exhaustion of the talk sinking in. But it wasn't the kind of tired that came from giving too much. It was the kind that came from letting go of something that had been held inside for too long. "Thank you for being here," Dorothy said, her voice soft but full of something she hadn't realized was there before. Haley nodded, her eyes meeting Dorothy's with something new in them: respect, understanding, maybe even admiration. "I meant what I said, Dorothy," Haley added, her voice low. "I'll be here. We still have things to talk about." Dorothy nodded, feeling a quiet weight lift. Whatever had come before, whatever distance had existed between them, it was beginning to fade. They weren't just talking about the past anymore. They were stepping into something new. And for the first time, Dorothy felt the stirring of something beyond the weight of her decisions, the beginnings of something more. Something she hadn't been able to name before, but now, she could feel it in the room. Her story was no longer just hers, it was theirs too. Jason sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter from the IRS, his eyes scanning the official-looking document as his fingers trembled around the edges. Brianna sat beside him, her face pale, the color drained from her skin as she read through the same letter. They had both been bracing for this, but now that it was here, the reality hit them harder than they'd expected. Audit escalation confirmed, dependency claim denied. The words on the page blurred together, the meaning of them sinking in with a heavy, suffocating weight. This was no simple issue. This was a full-blown legal nightmare. "Dorothy's name is circled," Jason muttered under his breath, his hand shaking as he pointed at the document. "They flagged her as the primary issue." Brianna's gaze shifted nervously from the letter to Jason, her mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. This wasn't supposed to happen. They hadn't planned for this. The deductions they'd relied on, the lifeline they thought they had. It was all unraveling, fast and without mercy. The phone rang, shattering the silence. Brianna grabbed it with a sense of dread, knowing who it would be: the accountant. "Hello?" Brianna answered, her voice barely above a whisper. The voice on the other end was terse, clipped. "I'm sorry, but I have to drop you as clients. The audit escalated. It's serious, and there's nothing we can do to resolve it without the proper documentation. You should have known better than to file with that dependency claim." Brianna stood, the phone slipping from her ear as she stumbled backward. Jason's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you kidding me?" she whispered to herself, before the phone clicked off. She sank into a chair, her body heavy with the weight of the situation. Jason looked over at her, his face taut with frustration. "What are we going to do now?" he asked, his voice tinged with panic. But even as he spoke, he knew the answer. There was no simple fix. There was no way to undo this. Across town, Dorothy was in her small kitchen at Sweet Haven, the smell of banana bread wafting through the air. It was a comforting, homey scent, the kind of warmth that had once filled her own home. But now it was something she made just for herself, her own small act of normalcy in a world that had turned upside down. She carefully set the loaf of banana bread on a plate and covered it with a napkin, then grabbed her keys and left her apartment. The walk to the administration office was short, and the streets were quiet, just like the life she was building. She had no idea where things were with Jason and Brianna now, and truth be told, she didn't care. They had made their choices, and she had made hers. The bread was just a gesture, something small that felt like a small measure of closure. She wasn't holding grudges, no, that wasn't her style. But she also wasn't going to go out of her way to clean up the mess they had made. When she arrived at the admin office, she handed the banana bread to the receptionist, a friendly woman with glasses who always smiled when she saw Dorothy. "For the team," she said, her voice warm, the small exchange feeling like a strange kind of victory. As she turned to leave, Marge was standing by the door, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on her face. "You know what's happening," Marge said, her voice calm but full of that underlying knowing. It wasn't a question. Dorothy gave a short nod, her expression unreadable. She had been waiting for the moment when the world would start catching up to what she had set in motion. The IRS had just dropped the bomb. She had expected it even, but there was no point in worrying. She had done what she needed to do. Want to know how much they owe? Marge asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Dorothy smiled faintly, the kind of smile that was both satisfied and detached. No, she replied softly. I already collected. Back at the house, Jason and Brianna sat in silence, staring at the pile of unopened bills and the IRS letter. The weight of it all was crushing. The phone calls from lawyers, accountants, and now, the IRS. It was all too much to handle. What are we going to do? Brianna asked, her voice cracking, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. Jason didn't have an answer. He was in a daze, running through numbers, running through worst-case scenarios in his head. But none of it seemed to matter anymore. Their world was collapsing, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. At Sweet Haven, Dorothy sat at her small kitchen table, the room quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner in the background. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced down at the screen. Another notification. This time, it was from her old journal. She started writing again, a quiet project that had taken shape as a way to process everything. She opened it and smiled softly at the title she'd typed just a few days ago. Deductions and Departures. Her fingers hovered over the keys and she began typing. The truth is, they never really saw me. They saw the woman who cooked the dinners, cleaned the house, kept the books. The woman who let herself be used. But they never saw the person who was quietly losing herself, bit by bit. They didn't know I was still here, but I've found my voice again, and I will make sure they know it, whether they want to or not. Dorothy leaned back in her chair, the quiet satisfaction settling over her like a blanket. The work wasn't finished, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was finally writing the story that had always belonged to her. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't look at it. She didn't need to. This was her story now, and no one could take that from her. The morning sun filtered through the leaves of the garden at Sweet Haven, casting long shadows on the well-kept paths. Dorothy stepped slowly, her hand grazing the tops of the flowers as she walked. The garden had become a sanctuary for her, a place of peace where she could breathe without the weight of expectations. Every bloom here seemed to speak to her in a way the world outside hadn't in years. She had tended to this space, both literal and metaphorical, cultivating it with care, with a quiet love she had never allowed herself to offer the people who should have seen her for what she was. Haley walked beside her, a few paces behind, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She had come to visit again. The soft sound of her sneakers on the gravel paths joining the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves. She was more subdued today, quieter than the last time they had spoken. Dorothy could sense it. A shift. Something in Haley had changed since the last conversation. She was still the girl who had once barely known Dorothy, but now there was something different in her. Something deeper. They walked in silence for a while, each step taken with intention. Haley's eyes wandered over the flowers, her fingers brushing the petals as they passed by. "This place is beautiful," she said quietly. "You've really made it your own." Dorothy glanced at her, her lips curling slightly. "Yes, I've finally made it mine," she said softly, the words almost a confession. She had spent years making everyone else's world her own, bending herself to fit into spaces that weren't designed for her. But now, here, in this garden, she was finally learning how to exist on her own terms. Haley was quiet for a moment before speaking again, her voice hesitant. "I've been thinking about what you said, about showing up. Her gaze turned toward Dorothy, searching her face as if trying to understand something that had previously eluded her. I want to do better. I want to be here. For you. Dorothy's gaze softened. She could see the sincerity in Haley's eyes, the quiet yearning to be part of something real, something that didn't come with strings or expectations. It was the same yearning Dorothy had had for so many years, but had never allowed herself to ask for. Start with showing up, Dorothy said gently, her voice steady. That's 80% of it. The rest comes in time. She smiled a little, a faint tug at the corners of her lips. The hardest part is letting go of the guilt, the things you think you're supposed to do for people who don't see you. Haley's face clouded, and she stopped walking, her hand brushing against one of the rose bushes as if steadying herself. I get it, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I've been thinking about everything, about what you've been through. I don't want to make the same mistakes. Her voice cracked slightly, and she wiped at her eyes as though embarrassed. Dorothy watched her, standing still, letting the moment unfold. It wasn't often that people expressed their vulnerability to her, not in this way, not with the same honesty she had been denying herself for so long. Haley was different. She was seeing her. Truly seeing her. Haley, Dorothy said, her voice soft but firm, you're not responsible for anyone's mistakes except your own. And your time will come, but it has to start now. With you. You can't keep carrying the weight of what others did to me. Or to you. Haley nodded, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. There was an understanding in her eyes now, something Dorothy had never seen before in her. It was the kind of look that made Dorothy realize how much she had been silently waiting for someone to truly see her. To feel her, not as a side character in someone else's story, but as a woman with her own life, her own desires, her own needs. Dorothy reached into her bag, her fingers brushing the papers inside. She pulled out a small document, something she had been thinking about for days now, something she had decided only after the talk with Marge. Haley glanced at her, her curiosity piqued, but Dorothy remained quiet as she handed over the papers. Haley hesitated before taking them, her hands shaking slightly as she read the words. I'm making you my power of attorney, Dorothy said simply. Her voice held no hesitation, no doubt. Not now. Not yet. But when the time comes, you'll be the one to make decisions for me, for my future. I trust you with that. Haley's eyes widened and she looked up at Dorothy, stunned. I didn't expect this. Her voice was small, the weight of the responsibility dawning on her. Dorothy smiled softly, a calmness washing over her. You don't have to be perfect. You just need to show up, and when the time comes, you'll know what to do. I'm giving you the tools, Haley. You'll find your way. Haley took a step back, looking at the papers in her hands and then back at Dorothy. She didn't speak immediately, her lips pressed tight as if trying to keep her emotions in check. Dorothy could see the tears welling up in her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, Dorothy felt something she hadn't realized she'd missed. Connection. Thank you, Haley whispered, her voice breaking. She wiped her eyes again, embarrassed by the outpouring. But Dorothy only nodded. She didn't need more than that. They stood there for a moment, silent and still, as the garden around them seemed to hum with new energy, the wind stirring the leaves. The moment felt sacred, as if Haley's willingness to take this step for Dorothy was the beginning of something new. The past was gone, erased by decisions that had been made in the quiet of the night, in the privacy of their own thoughts. And now, with each step forward, each action taken, Dorothy was no longer the woman who had been used. She was the one who had chosen her own path, and Haley was walking beside her. Not behind her, not ahead of her, but alongside her. For the first time in a long while, Dorothy felt at peace. The soft hum of the conference room filled the air as Dorothy sat at the long wooden table, her fingers wrapped around a pen, staring at the papers in front of her. A folder was spread before her, the final details of the Dorothy McKinley Tax Education Grant, now on the verge of becoming a reality. The foundation was hers, all of it, created by her own hand and vision. The $25,000 endowment, raised through careful planning and the restructured will, would go toward educating others, particularly women, on how to navigate the often confusing maze of tax laws. The thought of it was more satisfying than she could have imagined. The feeling of control, of making something real out of years of silence and sacrifice, was intoxicating. Marge, who had been with her every step of the way, sat across from her, scanning the documents. "It's all set, Dorothy," she said, her voice filled with pride. "This is more than a legacy. This is your message to the world." Dorothy nodded but said nothing. She didn't need to hear it again. She knew what this was. This wasn't just about taxes or the endowment, or even the grant itself. It was about showing the world that she was more than just a line on a tax return. This was her voice. This was her message. She picked up the phone as it buzzed, her heart steady. It was a local reporter from the Boise Sentinel asking for an interview. Dorothy hesitated, the idea of being in the spotlight still a bit foreign to her. But she had learned, through months of quiet reflection, that the truth was the only thing that mattered now. And if she was going to speak, she would speak plainly. No fluff, no glamour, just the truth. "Let's do it," she said with a small, calm smile. The interview was scheduled for the following afternoon. Dorothy had insisted on keeping it simple. No formal setting, no staged photographs. Just the story. Her story. When the reporter arrived, she was surprised to find that Dorothy had requested the interview take place in her apartment at Sweet Haven. It was quieter, more intimate, away from the press conferences and the artificial world of image. The reporter, a young woman with dark hair and glasses, seemed a little out of her element but adjusted quickly. She had no idea what kind of story she was walking into, and as Dorothy sat down across from her, she knew the truth would be sharp. There would be no sugarcoating, no tidy narratives. "Ms. McKinley, can you tell me about the grant you've established in your name?" Dorothy leaned forward slightly, folding her hands together. The warm light from the window spilled over the room, highlighting the soft lines of her face, the calm that radiated from her. "It's simple," she said, her voice steady. "It's about giving people the tools they need to protect themselves. I've been on the other side of that. I've been the one they tried to use. But I won't be used anymore." The reporter scribbled down notes, nodding. But Dorothy could tell she was trying to figure out the angle. She wasn't sure what the reader expected to hear, but Dorothy wasn't going to play that game. "It's not about the money," Dorothy continued, her voice stronger now. "It's about something deeper. People like me, people who give and give, need to learn how to protect themselves. We give our peace away for a tax break or a few kind words, but it's never enough. It never is. So, I'm using my story to help someone else." The reporter looked up from her notebook, sensing the sincerity. "And what about the tax situation with your family? How do you feel about the way things have turned out?" Dorothy paused for a moment, her eyes softening. She had thought about it, more than she cared to admit, but there was no going back now. She had already chosen her path. "I gave them warmth," Dorothy said, her voice quiet but firm. "They filed me cold." The words hit the air like stones dropping in water, ripples spreading outward. There was no bitterness in her tone, just the cold truth. The warmth she had offered had been met with a cold calculation, and now the world would know. She would not pretend it didn't matter. She would not pretend it didn't hurt. The reporter shifted uncomfortably but nodded, writing quickly. "You're speaking out against your own son and daughter-in-law. Isn't that difficult? Dorothy's eyes met hers with an unwavering calm. It's difficult, but not as difficult as living a lie. They've made their choices, and so have I. I'm not going to sit here and apologize for living my truth. It's mine to live, and I will. Later that evening, the article went live. Dorothy didn't rush to read it. She wasn't interested in the reaction. The headline said it all. She was a line on their return. Until she removed herself. Jason would read it. He would see the words for the first time, and he would understand. He would understand that this was no longer about tax deductions or financial maneuvering. This was about a woman reclaiming herself. As she sat in her apartment, sipping tea, her phone buzzed with a message from Marge. "Did you see it?" Marge wrote. Dorothy picked up the phone, typing back, "I've seen it. Let them talk. I'm done being quiet." Jason, at home with Brianna, stared at the headline of the article. His stomach twisted with an emotion he couldn't name. The words stung more than he wanted to admit, but he said nothing. He stayed silent, his mind whirling, the truth settling heavily on his chest. Brianna, beside him, stared at her phone. She didn't speak, didn't even glance at Jason. Then, after a long silence, she stood up abruptly, her fingers scrolling to delete her social accounts. Everything that had once tied her to the past, everything that had tried to tie her to Dorothy. As the screen blinked to confirm the deletions, Jason looked away, not sure where to place his own guilt, not sure what to say. He couldn't undo what had been done. And now, it was too late. The storm Dorothy had set in motion was only just beginning, and no one could stop it. The soft click of the door shutting behind her echoed through the small office. Travis Lane sat at his desk, the familiar stack of papers before him. Dorothy stood at the window, staring out at the quiet street, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. She had been through every step, every hurdle. This was it. The last piece of the puzzle. The final form was in front of her. It had been carefully reviewed, rechecked, and now it was ready. The tax issues, the asset separation, the estate planning, it was all airtight. Dorothy had planned it meticulously, step by step, with no room for error. She had made sure that nothing was left to chance, no more empty promises, no more being invisible. She could feel the finality in the air. The life she had lived, the one she had sacrificed so much for, had been dismantled piece by piece. But what she had built in its place was something entirely her own. Travis shuffled through the documents one last time, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's all good, Dorothy," he said, his voice calm but with a note of respect. "Everything's in place. Assets protected, inheritance earned, peace secured." Dorothy nodded, her hand resting on the back of the chair beside her. "I know," she said, her voice soft but firm. The years of keeping quiet, of holding on to the pieces of a life she had never truly chosen, were behind her. And now, for the first time, she felt what it was to stand in her own power. Marge had been there through every step too, offering quiet support, never pushing, just being there. As they had agreed, she would be the one to handle the legacy, the one to ensure that Dorothy's wishes were carried out with precision. The thought of Marge, always steady, always reliable, brought a small smile to Dorothy's face. "You've done more than anyone could ask," Travis said, looking up from the papers. He seemed genuinely impressed by the thoroughness, by the clarity of the plan. "You've ensured that no one can take what's yours. They won't be able to touch it." Dorothy met his gaze, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "I've kept receipts. They kept thinking I wouldn't use them," she said, a slight smile playing at the corners of her lips. She hadn't just been smart in how she'd handled the financial side of things. She had kept every record, every piece of paper that could protect her. And now, it was all in place. Later that day, as the sunlight filtered through the blinds of her small apartment, Dorothy sat at her kitchen table with the original dependency form, the one that had started it all. She studied it for a moment, the red line she had drawn through her name stark against the white paper. It was a simple act, but it had been the final severance from a life that had tried to claim her. She placed it in her cedar box, the one where she kept her most cherished memories. The box was old, worn, but sturdy, just like the woman who had made the choice to take back what was hers. The red line through the form was a symbol of the decision she had made, one that had cost her more than she had ever anticipated. But it was the right decision, the necessary decision. Dorothy closed the box slowly, a sense of closure settling over her. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even about the IRS, the deductions, or the betrayal. It was about standing in her own truth, taking ownership of her life in a way she had never been able to before. The years of quiet compromise were gone, replaced by a peace she had fought hard to earn. Marge arrived at her apartment later that afternoon, carrying a small cake wrapped in cellophane. "I thought you might like a little celebration," she said, setting it down on the table with a knowing look. "Filed and free," she added, her eyes twinkling. Dorothy chuckled softly, lifting the cake from the box. "I wasn't expecting a celebration," she said, her voice warm with gratitude. "But I'll take it. It feels good, Marge. It feels like I've finally earned something I've always deserved." Marge nodded, her gaze softening. "You have, Dorothy. You've earned your peace, and no one can take that from you." As Dorothy cut the first slice, she felt a small but profound shift in herself. The world had always tried to force her into a box, into a role that she wasn't meant to play. But now, that role was gone. There were no more expectations. There were no more tax breaks that weren't hers to give. There was just Dorothy McKinley, a woman who had finally learned how to stand on her own. The doorbell rang just as they were finishing their tea, and Haley stepped into the room, her eyes bright, her smile genuine. She had come to visit, just as she promised. "Smells good in here," Haley said, her voice light, carrying with it the sound of a young woman who had finally started to figure out what it meant to show up. She came to the table, giving Dorothy a quick hug, something Dorothy had never thought would feel so natural. Haley looked down at the cake. "What's the occasion?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Dorothy smiled, her eyes soft with affection for the young woman who had been there for her in ways no one else had been. "I filed a break of my own," Dorothy said simply. Haley paused, her eyes meeting Dorothy's with a deep understanding. "I'm glad you did." Dorothy didn't need to say more. Haley was learning. They were both learning. And for the first time, it felt like the future was something they could both walk into, together, side by side, in a world where Dorothy was finally free. Her story was no longer just hers, it was theirs too. And that was enough.